I'm Mike Al-Karaki. I am an attorney and a member of the Chicago Bar Association. I practice plaintiff's personal injury and medical malpractice at Leahy and Hosty here in Chicago. I'm also an adjunct professor of advocacy at Loyola Law School here in Chicago. And on today's show, we are going to explore the structure of the Special Counsel Russia probe and related investigations. We're lucky to have two very special guests with us. Renato Mariotti is an attorney, a CNN legal analyst, former federal prosecutor, and a partner at Thompson and Coburn. And Tom Breen is a legendary, so true, in the words of Donald Trump, criminal defense attorney who has handled and won countless high-profile acquittals. His cases have appeared in movies, television shows, and seem to be in the news routinely these days. Both Renato and Tom have special insight regarding today's topic, and I'm going to ask them each to provide a little bit more background on themselves, their careers, and their connections to the issues we're going to discuss today. Tom, why don't you start us off?
Sure. I started out in 1972 as an assistant state's attorney and enjoyed 6 or 7 years there. I was appointed special prosecutor in Livingston County to prosecute homicide cases that resulted from a July 22nd, 1978 riot. I then went into private practice, and for the last 10 or 15 years I've partnered with Todd Pugh, and we do pretty much exclusively white-collar criminal defense as well as state criminal defense cases. The case that we'll be discussing here was kind of a walk-in, but I'll explain that later.
Sure. And Renato?
As you pointed out, I was a federal prosecutor. I had that job until a couple of years ago. And since that time, since I left, I've become a frequent commentator on legal topics. I have my Twitter feed, for example. I comment and discuss all sorts of legal topics, but in particular, I have discussed the legal issues the Trump administration has, including the Mueller investigation, many of the related investigations. I have my own podcast called On Topic, and on there we discuss an issue of the week. And often that topic is legal related. I've discussed the Mueller investigation and other investigations on that podcast. You also mentioned I'm a CNN legal analyst, so I frequently discuss legal topics, including this one, on the air. I also am a frequent commentator, I write op-eds, and I'm on the radio as well.
Sure, thanks very much. Let's start with the origin of the investigation. And just by way of background, we are inundated with ubiquitous coverage of all things Russia and related investigations, and there's a lot that's kind of playing out dramatically. We can definitely get into that, but I think it's important from time to time to focus on the structure of these investigations, because I don't think that that's something that people have a really solid handle on, which you may be able to assist with. Tom, would you like to start with sort of the origin of the investigation?
In, I believe it was early March, Ben Carson's campaign was winding down, and George had wanted to work originally for Trump. And with Ben Carson winding down, he again requested to be part of the Trump campaign. He was hired, so to speak, as a foreign policy advisor in mid-March of 2016. Whether or not he was the start of all this or not, I don't know, because I think there's so much more to the case than just George Papadopoulos's. But in March, once it was known that he was going to sit as a policy advisor for Trump, he was approached by a fellow by the name of Mitsud, who reported to him that he had many, many contacts with Russia and that he would travel to Moscow. During a conversation with Mitsud told him that the Russians have dirt on Hillary Clinton and they have a certain number or thousands of emails. That is the first I know of where emails were discussed or Russian not interference, but hacking had been discussed. What is interesting is that there was a photograph taken of Trump's foreign policy advisors, which included multiple people, but George Papadopoulos. It's almost become somewhat of a famous photograph. Back in April of 2016, he went back to London, and at some point in time he ran into, and it may have been a social event, an Australian diplomat. And according to the Australian diplomat, George mentioned to him that he had had this conversation with this individual who had said there was Russian hacking and that Russians had multiple emails of Hillary Clinton. Apparently, the Australian really thought nothing much of it until there was a public mention of Russian hacking, and I believe that was in August of 2016. When the Australian realized that he might have heard something much earlier that he did not pay close attention to and that it might be relevant, he then notified, I believe, Britain's diplomats, and they made contact with the FBI or U.S. officials. And that was, as far as I can tell, the first time the FBI would have known, or at least had strong suspicions, that Russia had in fact hacked Hillary Clinton's emails. Now, I may be wrong on that, but that is how George Papadopoulos got involved, is because the Australian, several months after hearing George tell it, reported that information to the authorities. And then that part of George's investigation began.
Sure, and that is certainly reported, and you identified whether this is true or not, subject to debate, but Papadopoulos is his case is sort of reported as maybe one of the first dominoes in the investigation. Now, that may not be the full story. Fair?
That may very well not be. Now, we've learned through requests of the U.S. Attorney that there was no FISA warrants used on George Papadopoulos. If there were FISA warrants used on somebody, they may very well have been issued prior to George's name even being mentioned.
Sure. Go ahead, Ron.
I was just going to say, so one thing that's important to note, because there's been some misinformation coming particularly from the White House and their camp on this, the dossier that is discussed on that has been controversial has nothing to do with the origin of the Mueller investigation. My understanding is this started, it was obviously well before Mueller was appointed. As Tom was pointing out, it was a counterintelligence investigation. So it wasn't a criminal investigation necessarily of a crime that was occurring in the United States. It was an investigation of foreign agents who were at work in the United States.
Right. So why don't we sort of jump to the appointment of Robert Mueller as special counsel? And Renato, if you want to provide a little bit of background, I know that there's a whole story there too.
Sure.
But if you want to provide a little bit of foundation for that and talk about the origins of his investigation and his order or charter in terms of the scope of that investigation.
Sure. So typically the way investigations are conducted is the FBI and other federal agents conduct investigations, and they work with attorneys at the Justice Department. And that's important. Obviously, attorneys help them get legal process that they might need. They issue subpoenas. They help them get search warrants, wiretaps, FISA warrants, etc. That's the typical way that things go. In early 2017, there were reports that James Comey had conversations with Trump, and in fact, he was fired unceremoniously. Shortly after him being fired, in a very unexpected move, there became reports of his conversations with Trump. Some of those were troubling. There was a suggestion that Trump had told Comey to let Michael Flynn go, suggesting that he should not investigate Michael Flynn, former national security advisor, one of the individuals under investigation by the FBI. Similarly, there was a suggestion that by President Trump that this was a cloud over his presidency, and he wanted the cloud lifted. So in the wake of that, Rod Rosenstein, who's the Deputy Attorney General, and as to these investigations involving the Trump campaign, is effectively acting as the Attorney General, because the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, was one of the people in that photograph that Tom mentioned, along with George Papadopoulos. He was intimately involved with these issues in the campaign, so he properly recused himself.
Although he's, not to interrupt you, I apologize, but Trump has kind of been critical of Sessions for recusing himself.
That's right, and that's unusual. I mean, I will say, as a former prosecutor who was in the Justice Department for almost a decade, recusing yourself is a routine thing you do, because you do it when you're required to do it, because there's ethical reasons to do it. There might be potentially a conflict of interest. In the case of Jeff Sessions, he would be overseeing an investigation of the campaign that he participated in.
Right.
To me, it's very telling that President Trump is attacking Attorney General Sessions for recusing himself. He more recently has suggested that Sessions should have quashed the investigations of 2 Republican congressmen who were indicted, and in fact, Trump suggested that they were going to lose those seats as a result. To me, that those sort of statements by Trump are best understood as him taking an attitude that the FBI and DOJ should not be neutrally investigating and enforcing the laws, but instead should be a tool used by him to help his friends and hurt his enemies. But in terms of Rosenstein appointing Mueller, there was a public order that essentially said that he would be investigating contacts or collusion with Russia. He would be I think, taking over current investigations that already were in place, and he'd investigate anything arising from those investigations, which of course would include the allegations against Comey. Those are, I think, those issues with Comey are particularly why a special counsel investigation was warranted. Since that time, there have become additional reasons why it's warranted, like the comments I just mentioned. You wouldn't want someone overseeing or having their fingers in the investigation when they're dealing with the president, and he's pushing them to help his friends. But obviously these are, essentially the president himself is under investigation for those statements and actions he took towards James Comey.
Sure. Now, as we move forward a little bit, I'd like to ask you to address a couple legal terms, things we hear about in the news a lot. We hear a lot about collusion, conspiracy. There is certainly a negative connotation associated with those terms. Is collusion or conspiracy crimes in and of themselves or not?
Well, collusion is not a crime, and Giuliani just loves to say that, and nobody's ever said, I don't think, that collusion is a crime. Collusion, I think, includes aiding and abetting or promoting somehow the Russians in their hacking or the dissemination of the stolen emails. So collusion is not, there's no crime called collusion, but aiding and abetting a crime makes you just as guilty as if you were the principal. So this big debate about collusion being a crime has never really bothered me much, but sure enough, Giuliani and the Trump people love to mention that. Trump just this morning I saw on TV doing one of his helicopter interviews was saying there's no collusion. Well, nobody gives a darn if there's collusion or not. We care if you aid and abetted and you entered into an agreement with a third party to violate a crime. That's what we care about, and that's what I'm sure Mueller is investigating.
Sure. And what are those crimes that the aiding and abetting might be directed to? What are the material crimes, the things people really care about?
Sure.
Or the
and
system cares
One
about?
thing I'll just step back and say, too, because I think Tom is exactly right in terms of what sort of things that we might be talking about with collusion. Aiding and abetting is just when you know about a crime and you help make it succeed in some way. That's essentially what aiding and abetting is. But what those underlying crimes are, one, Tom mentioned earlier, was computer hacking. Certainly hacking servers in the United States is a federal crime. Another potential federal crime is receiving foreign contributions in connection with the United States election. Campaigns are not permitted to receive contributions from foreign entities. Obviously, we've also seen campaign finance violations in a different context, which we can talk about at some point.
Referring to Michael Cohen.
Michael Cohen. And then there's also obviously all sorts of other, and I'm going to call them, and this is probably a bad term to use, garden variety, white collar crimes. They're garden variety to people like Tom and myself who represent people. I also represent people who are investigated for white collar crimes, and I used to, when I was a federal prosecutor, my focus was on white collar crime. So that's things like fraud, like money laundering and so forth. That's certainly another focus of the Mueller investigation. And then obviously another subject that is talked a lot about, which is obstruction of justice.
Sure. So you've addressed some of the areas of inquiry. We made a reference to Michael Cohen. Paul Manafort has been on the news, first with a conviction, then it looks like with a plea. Trump has been critical of the concept of immunity, or flipping, as he says it, even kind of invoking this kind of mobster-like language that he doesn't like witnesses to flip or rat. I don't know if he used the word rat.
He did.
He did. Okay.
At one point.
I don't want to put words in Trump's mouth, right? So let's talk a little bit about the concept of immunity and working with the federal government, making a deal to provide testimony.
I think you'd be best to answer that question because you've used it successfully and properly.
Sure. Thank you. I would say as a federal prosecutor, it is a very common tactic to question witnesses and try to get them to cooperate with the government. So that is something that occurs in all sorts of cases. And in a very garden variety way, it doesn't necessarily need to involve a deal or anything like that. Often it is the case that somebody who's under investigation will come forward before they're sentenced or before they plead guilty and tell the government what they know about a variety of activities. And regardless of whether they get a deal or not, I think judges look favorably upon that because the legal system generally regards it as a good thing when somebody comes forward and tells the government what they know about potential crimes. Now, often that takes the form of a cooperation agreement, where what happens is somebody who is under investigation says, I would like to get a better deal. And of course, many people in the Mueller investigation have done that, from Paul Manafort to George Papadopoulos, for example. They'll go to the prosecutor and they will provide information. And if the prosecutor believes that the information is truthful, if they believe that the information is valuable to them in some way, in other words, it moves the ball forward in either indicting somebody they wouldn't have otherwise indicted, or it makes a case that they would have been able to bring significantly better, then they will generally give them some credit towards their sentence. And what that would mean is the government would make a recommendation that would be for the judge to go lower than they would have otherwise gone in the sentence. That's essentially.
And where Trump misses the point is if someone flips or is granted immunity, their credibility is still an issue before the jury. And what the government normally does, and I've yet to see them not do it, they corroborate that person's testimony with independent evidence to bolster the credibility of that witness. Does that mean that every witness the government calls who's made a deal is telling the truth? No. But arguably, they attempt to corroborate what that witness is saying. I think and I don't know the details, but I'm sure Gates, who testified in the Manafort trial, I'm sure his testimony, you can call him whatever you want to call him, Trump, but I'm sure it was corroborated by other evidence. He didn't just get up there all alone just to tell a story without any supporting documents.
It's interesting. I think Tom brings up the example that I thought was exactly the right example for this too. Robert Gates testified at a trial. I think Tom's making the right point. At that trial, the defense made their opening statement was focused on Gates. Their closing argument was focused on Gates. They were attacking his credibility. And usually, I certainly hear in the Northern District of Illinois in Chicago, where Tom and I practice, there's an instruction that's given by the judge that says you need to take their testimony, the testimony of a cooperator, with caution and great care. And in the Gates testimony, as Tom points out, the government, their argument at closing was, you don't even need Gates. We have all these documents. The documents were the key witness.
Right, and that's one of the benefits I think we have. I think we have here 3 trial lawyers who are actively trying cases on a regular basis, understand the rules of evidence and how an investigation can make its way not just into the news, but what actually ends up in court, what happens in court. And I think you both made a reference to a witness who cuts a deal with prosecutors is going to be subject to vigorous and probably pretty effective cross-examination. On the other side of that, if there are corroborative witnesses that will help bolster that witnesses' credibility, and the government will not, if they are able to, will not rely simply on that witness's testimony. Is that a fair summation?
I think it is, yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
So let's talk briefly, even though there's so much here, about Manafort's plea and Cohen's plea, and in the context of this, I would suggest Trump uses he's done a good job using words to market concepts, and it says witch hunt all the time. Now, some people are very annoyed with that, but it's got some traction, and his followers are repeating it. So it's effective in that regard, even if we might strongly disagree with it. Are Cohen and Manafort materially related to the core Russia investigation?
Well, what I would say to that is that it's a misnomer to talk about this as one investigation.
Okay.
Inside the Justice Department, the way this is there are multiple investigations that are entered in their computer systems for different individuals. You have a case against George Papadopoulos, you'll have cases against Paul Manafort, you have cases against Michael Flynn, etc. And those cases, is there some relationship between them? Sort of. It certainly, Paul Manafort was associated with the same campaign as George Papadopoulos. But an investigation of George Papadopoulos, both as to lying to the FBI and potentially to whatever conversations he had, and from a counterintelligence perspective, is very different from investigating Paul Manafort for money laundering.
Right.
So we talk about it in the press, and I'm guilty of it because I'm on CNN talking about this stuff all the time. We talk about it as there's the Mueller investigation, the Russia investigation, and really it's a group of investigations. And in addition to that, some of those investigations are counterintelligence investigations, where the focus is to make sure that we stop foreign agents from being involved, and some of them are criminal. Different thing.
Sure. Okay. Anything to add to that, Tom?
Well, just what I find, and as you were talking, I was just thinking to myself, I do not understand how Trump gets away with just saying witch hunt, witch hunt, witch hunt. I do not understand. And what is so depressing to those like me who follow this stuff on a daily basis, much like a sports fan follows the ball games, the fact that he gets away with calling this a witch hunt and demeaning the process, it really upsets me. I don't mean to be political here, but it just happens to be a fact. Has there been one Republican congressman or one Republican senator to say, wait a minute, this isn't a witch hunt, there's something to this? Several people have pled guilty, another person has been convicted. Where is the love of the law? Where is the respect for law? It's just not there. And I don't even see, as a lawyer who's a member of several different bar associations, as attorneys, I think we should be taking more of an aggressive stand against this witch hunt and this belittling of the process. This is how we ferret out corruption. And if there's corruption there, and I believe there's plenty of it, we should destroy it.
Sure. And go ahead.
I just was going to say, I couldn't agree more with what Tom said. I think it's interesting, there was some movement by Republicans early on in particular to defend Mueller, to make positive statements about protecting him. There was a bipartisan piece of legislation introduced in the Senate. I think Lindsey Graham was one of the people who introduced it. And it was blocked by Mitch McConnell, who said it's not necessary at this time. Very interesting. Suggests to me that he wanted to leave open the possibility of Trump engaging in some measures that Republicans might favor in the future. And then since that time, people, including Lindsey Graham, on the Republican side, have really shifted. To me, one of the most telling moments was when Mueller issued the indictment of that group of Russians who were engaging not only in computer hacking. They actually hacked here in Illinois our voting systems, penetrated the systems, stole information. They were engaging in disinformation campaigns and so on. He issues this indictment. The response from Republicans across the board, the RNC, Speaker Paul Ryan, all of them was, this investigation needs to be shut down. And that is such an unusual and disturbing reaction to an investigation that's producing very significant results, like Tom was mentioning, convictions and indictments.
And I don't mean to be dramatic, but it is frightening to think that legitimate investigations could be shut down for political reasons. That is very, very frightening.
Sure, and a couple points on that. One is this is certainly, and really hasn't been ever, a political show, but as lawyers, the process is so critical to the things we do. And I think there has a major concern is that the administration is sort of trampling on that process and undermining certainly public confidence in that process. And we don't have to go into everything that's happened in the last week, but a lot of the process has been replaced by more sort of dramatic factual scenarios that distract from maintaining the integrity of our legal processes and institutions. And I do have one question that we could probably finish on related to that, which is, and it does sort of relate in general to some of the issues related to the Kavanaugh hearings and appointment, but the issue of executive privilege has come up in the context of this Russia investigation, the related investigations, and I was hoping that perhaps you could both can speak to the concept that the president maybe should or should not be susceptible to the courts.
Well, I have an opinion, but I cannot cite cases, so I will turn to my partner here.
Sure.
Okay. Well, let me, as a starting point, say that we do have some cases that very much indicate that the president is not above the law. Obviously, United States versus Nixon involved a subpoena for records to the presidency. The Supreme Court held that grand jury subpoena had to be complied with by the president, who ultimately resigned, obviously, in that case. We also have in the United States versus Clinton versus Jones case, where Paula Jones was suing President Clinton. President Clinton argued, and the D.C. Circuit, I believe, agreed that he did not have to sit for a deposition in a civil case while he was president. Supreme Court disagreed with that, saying no one's above the law. I think, certainly on the topic of whether or not the president would have to sit for an interview or should sit for an interview, I think the weight of the law is certainly on that side. And in terms of, I think there has been an aggressive use of executive privilege to limit information gathered by the Mueller investigation, and it's been improperly done at times when it has not been formally invoked by the president, for example. Okay.
With that, I'd like to thank our viewers out there for tuning in, and thanks very much, Renato and Tom, for being present here and sharing your thoughts on this installation of You and the Law. Thank you very much.
Thank you.